Hello and welcome to today's Medicinal Monday on the Alter Health Podcast. I'm Dr. Susanna.
And I'm Dr. Ben.
And we've got Theo here who will also be joining us today for this episode of Medicinal Monday. We couldn't not just let him join since he clearly wants to be here. So
yeah, he's got his back to the camera, but
you're being a little shy.
Anywho, yeah, Theo's joining us for now, and we're talking about the gallbladder. And of course, we're making our way from head to toe, and I think we're almost there. We determined we've got 4 or 5 more systems, organs to talk about. And the gallbladder, to be honest, I was thinking, it's just this little thing. Like, do we have to talk a whole episode about it? But the fact is that, yeah, we do, because so many people have gallbladder issues. And to put a number on it, to put a statistic on it, I found that over 700,000 people have their gallbladders removed each year in the United States alone. And of course, the gallbladder removal, a cholecystectomy, is a very common surgical procedure, and the way conventionally that gallstones are treated. And gallstones and, a sludge in the gallbladder. That's the main thing that can become problematic and create a medical issue for the gallbladder. And of course, that, the surgical intervention and the removal of the gallbladder, that's just like, you just remove the issue. And that's the way that conventional medicine treats it. And of course, that is not to say that sometimes surgery isn't necessary, because when a gallstone blocks the bile duct, we can have, severe inflammation and infection and extreme pain in the right upper quadrant of the abdomen. And that often does deem surgical intervention. But of course, we want to be proactive. We want to listen to the early signs and potentially, of course, prevent this sort of thing from happening, but also potentially dissolve or reverse any gallstones that might be formed.
Right. But, it's so interesting that, when we consider, the conventional approach to gallbladder issues, there is a lack of prevention because the system isn't really set up to really help detect gallstone or gallbladder issues ahead of time, right?
It's kind of like appendicitis, it's like, and that's more of a head scratcher in terms of things that actually trigger that and cause that. But it's like, you can have appendicitis, go get your appendix taken out.
Right. And, some people will get kind of early signs of gallbladder issues. They'll have a little bit of tenderness or a little bit of achiness in their right upper quadrant.
Or indigestion of fat and all of these other things we'll talk about.
Right. But some people don't. And that's why for a lot of people that need to have the gallbladder removed is a more kind of, emergent situation. Maybe sometimes we can see with, liver enzymes or bilirubin levels on the comprehensive metabolic panel. Sometimes that can kind of clue a doctor into looking at the gallbladder via an ultrasound. But a lot of times this progression of gallstones or gallbladder issues really goes undetected. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything to prevent the issues, right?
Yeah, and I think that, like you're kind of alluding to, some of the things that we can tune in more so are not the laboratory work, which more or less stays within range unless there's some acute severe thing going on. But, the indigestion of fat, kind of the tummy aches, the bowel issues, digestive issues, these kind of things that maybe, you chalk them up to just being normal. Like, everyone's got a tummy ache after they eat. But the fact is that, once we start to create more health and balance in our body, we realize that a lot of these symptoms that are common are not normal and healthy. So of course, maybe we should take a few steps back and talk about what the gallbladder is, what the gallbladder does. Gallbladder is classically known as the bile sac. The liver has a relationship with the gallbladder. The liver produces and creates the bile. That's one of the functions of the liver. And then that bile that the liver creates is stored in a bile sac. And that bile is then released into the intestines when we eat a meal. And of course, bile is kind of like a digestive enzyme necessary for breaking down breaking down fat molecules for us to absorb and assimilate. So bile is essential for fat digestion. And fat and the gallbladder, that it's hard to talk about the gallbladder and gallbladder issues without talking about fat. And of course, you probably know that we don't like talking about fat on the podcast when we're talking about nutrition. We don't like talking about any individual macronutrient. But the fact is, when we do kind of break our food stuffs down into macronutrients, we can see that most people are eating way too much fatty stuff. And of course, that's primarily not from avocados and nuts and seeds. That's not what we're talking about. Most people are eating too much fatty stuff in the form of added processed refined oils. And also, of course, dairy products, animal products, etc., that really can put a strain on fat digestion and gallbladder health. So when we're eating higher fat meals over and over again, our liver is called on to create more bile. Our gallbladder is requires to store that bile and move that bile, and that process can become overwhelmed, overworked, and sluggish. And then, like I was saying, we can have stomach aches, like fat indigestion, after we have a fat heavy meal. And usually, it's not necessarily for the people who are on like a strict quote unquote keto diet. That might be like, dare I say, cleaner than a standard American diet that's like fried foods, like fried onion rings and French fries, and kind of the combination of the high fat foods with the carbohydrate rich foods, which can be much more problematic for our digestion, for our gallbladder. That's not to say that a ketogenic diet doesn't pose a risk to gallbladder issues as well, but it's classically more of that kind of standard American low quality, nutrition, and that combination of high carbohydrate rich foods with the fat rich foods.
Totally. Yeah. The classic kind of presentation, like the classic story that, we learn in medical school is, someone ate at McDonald's last night and, they come in late at night with intense right upper quadrant pain. What's going on?
Yeah. They've got cholecystitis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So diet that is high in fat is a major risk factor for gallbladder issues. Some other risk factors, just age, but we talked about that in our liver episode last week, how the longer we're living on this planet, the more burdens the liver and also subsequently the gallbladder take on.
Well, yeah. But you brought up it's not like the risk factors for gallbladder issues are the F's, right? The fat, 40, and female. And that's because, it's not like gallbladder issues get worse with age, like cancer. Cancer progression, the longer you're living, the more likely you're going to develop a lot of chronic diseases. But gallbladder issues kind of peaks around the age 40. And that's generally because of hormonal issues that are happening primarily within, females. And we're talking about like menopause stuff. So what's happening, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about like reproductive health and stuff. But during menopause phase, of course, there's a huge hormonal shift in the body. And this hormonal shift is managed and cleared by the liver. And that stress is put on the liver. The liver can't keep up with bile production and also hormonal regulation and detoxification. So something's got to give. And generally what does give is any number of those things, but oftentimes also the bile production, and the gallbladder issue results, and then people have their gallbladders removed. Also backing up, I just wanted to say that for people who are listening who don't have a gallbladder, because we in our group program a few months back, it was, someone asked about like, what about for those who don't have a gallbladder? And I was like, oh yeah, I forgot. Like a lot of people like, and then I was just called to ask like, so who doesn't have a gallbladder? And I think, close to half the people, in our group at one time like had their gallbladders removed, which again goes to show just how common of a surgical procedure this is. And yes, people can live a normal, healthy life without a gallbladder, but it blows my mind that when someone has their gallbladder removed, of course, you might ask the doctor, you might ask the surgeon, do I have to change my diet in any way? Is there anything that I shouldn't, eat? Chips, fried food, meat, dairy, anything at all. And most doctors, what I hear is that, oh, you don't have to worry about anything for the rest of your life. You're fine. And yes, they might be fine in terms of not developing gallbladder issues because they don't have a gallbladder issue to develop, but they're not fine in terms of optimal digestion, detoxification, etc. Because, and of course, since it's just, kind of common sense. If we don't have a bile sac, a sac to store our bile to digest fat, then we have to be more mindful of the fat that we are consuming, because any fat that we are consuming is going to be directly kind of putting a little bit of strain and burden on the liver directly, because the liver doesn't have that kind of accessory organ of the bile sac of the gallbladder to kind of take the load off a little bit.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's weird. The kind of analogy that came to mind for me is like, we always like to encourage people to meal prep, right? To have lots of food prepped in the fridge so that when hunger strikes, you can just open up the door and you don't need to like cook for a whole hour. You can just eat the food that's already been prepared. And the liver having a bile sac is, it's kind of like that. It's whipped up all this bile ahead of time. The bile is nicely stored in the sac. And then whenever the body consumes fat, it's like, okay, here we can use the bile that's in the sac versus calling upon the liver to make that bile from scratch on the moment, right?
Yeah. So of course, maybe shifting gears to talk about, okay, how do we actually live and eat in a way to prevent gallbladder issues? How do we live and eat in a way to optimize digestion and detoxification without a gallbladder? How do we live and eat to maybe we have had an incident of right upper quadrant pain. Maybe we did get an ultrasound. We saw it, and you saw a little stone in there, a few stones in there. Or maybe you've just had some ultrasound of your abdomen and the ultrasound technician or doctor was like, oh, yeah, there's your gallbladder and you've got some stones in there. You think like, oh, is there something I should do? And oftentimes people are, again, depending on the circumstance, people are like, recommended that they proactively remove their gallbladder. Like, oh, we can just go and snip that out so it doesn't cause you any problems in the future. And of course, because I was, again, just, on the good old Google machine, and it was like, gallstones, there's like the common questions. Can I heal gallstones naturally? And the answer is no. The answer is like, no, gallstones don't dissolve naturally. They must be removed surgically. Of course, there's also some quote unquote, pharmaceutical and other interventions like shockwave therapy to help like break up stones and other things that are kind of chemicals that you take that can potentially dissolve stones. But no, they can't be dissolved naturally. No, they must be treated or managed or taken out surgically or pharmaceutically. The fact is that that's not true. Gallstones can be resolved naturally, can be dissolved and resolved naturally, or they can kind of just like hang out. Maybe they won't completely dissolve. Like there might always be a little bit of what some people refer to as sand or gravel in the gallbladder, but it won't be to the point where it's problematic so that it lodges into the bile duct to create that kind of inflammation, infection scenario. So of course, the things that we can do to help our gallbladder resolve stones are just eating a fiber-rich, hydrating, whole food, plant-based diet that's naturally low in fat, naturally rich in phytonutrients, so that we're not continually adding to the sludge in the gallbladder that creates the stones and makes the stones grow bigger. And then in time, what can happen is that those little stones can just they just go out of the bile sac into the intestines and you flush them down the toilet. So that's potentially, one way that gallstones can resolve themselves.
Right. And, the same goes for how to approach eating if the gallbladder has been removed, right? We would
Yeah.
eat the same whole food plant based diet that's naturally low in fat, naturally rich in phytonutrients and carbohydrates. And that is going to be the easiest way for a body without a gallbladder to digest food, right? To not load up on lots of fat. It's not to say that you can't still enjoy the natural oils that are in nuts and avocados and seeds and everything like that, but certainly it's more beneficial to avoid the high fat foods, right? Oils, fried foods, uh, dairy and meat and eggs and all of that stuff, right?
Mhm.
But it's so interesting, we on one of our Thrive on Plants calls, it was so cool to hear from a couple people at this point now who had been getting kind of routine ultrasounds for other purposes, not related to gallbladder issues. But on a couple accounts, people had said, now that I've been eating whole food plant based for X amount of years, the recent imaging showed that I no longer have gallstones
Right.
when previously years ago I did. What happened? Where did they go?
Yeah. And that's again just to prove the point that yes, they can and do resolve naturally when we create the environment for them to do so.
Hmm.
It's not anything extraordinary. There's always, whenever there's a stone, that being said, whenever there's a stone in the gallbladder, there's always a risk that that stone can dislodge and get in the right spot to block the bile duct and to cause that pain
Right.
and that cramp, or maybe then that like long-term like occlusion that creates that, again, that inflammatory state. Cholecystitis is the inflammation of the gallbladder from cholelithiasis, which is the stone in the gallbladder. So that can happen. But the triggers for that are generally the high fat, the high fat kind of foods, the high fat, low quality foods. Again, you're probably not going to trigger a cholecystitis issue from eating like an avocado or guacamole or something like that. Right.
Right. Right. So then what about all these trendy gallbladder flushes and things like that?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. And so there is a trend out there of essentially the gallbladder flush that I'm familiar with is that you combine a lot of olive oil, like I forget how much it is, but several tablespoons of olive oil with a couple tablespoons of like lemon juice, pure lemon juice, and you blend that up. And then you drink it on an empty stomach first thing in the morning. And we've actually experimented with this way back
Yeah.
in medical school when we were experimenting with some juice cleanses. And the cleanse included kind of a pre-cleanse phase that had this gallbladder flush.
And
Man, it does not feel good in the stomach to drink all that oil at once, I will say.
to drink oil in general. Yeah. So, I guess in theory, what's supposed to be happening is that you put a bunch of oil in your body, like just oil, no fiber, no anything, oil and lemon. And
Maybe some orange juice too.
And the idea is that that oil, of course, tells the gallbladder, oh, secrete a bunch of bile. Like, let's get this oil digested. Let's get this oil absorbed. So the gallbladder secretes, like, just is forced to pump out and like flush. Ideally the gallbladder, release the bile from the gallbladder, and kind of like promote the. By the way, side tangent. One of the things that the bile does, and one of the things that the gallbladder does, is not only digest fat and break down fat, but it's also a route that the liver uses to shuttle out toxicity from the body. So you're shuttling out, you're breaking down fat, but you're also shuttling out all these potential toxins that are kind of making their way through the biliary tract into the intestines. And if you follow that gallbladder flush with just, most people are following it with like a bunch of food and then like eating more. But if the idea is if you just give your body like a shot of oil, then that like just overwhelms the gallbladder and kind of tricks the gallbladder into just doing this big flush mechanism. So that's the theory as far as I understand it. And
Are we fans of it now? I would
well,
say I'm not a fan of it
no,
now.
I'm not a fan of it now.
No.
I think what I would prefer to do is like not put it, the way I see it is like that drinking a glass of olive oil like it causes the gallbladder to work more. So my kind of understanding now, it's like, let's just let the gallbladder hang out. Let's let things process themselves. That's not to say that we don't eat any fat, because anytime we're eating, we're going to be eating fat and calling on our gallbladder to release bile to help break down and absorb that fat. And as that gallbladder releases bile, it's promoting the rest of detoxification processes that are happening in that liver gallbladder relationship. So it's not like we're not using that pathway. We're just not like pushing the gas pedal to like accelerate that pathway. We're just allowing that pathway to, run on its own.
Right.
Is there anything that you would add?
Yeah, just that in my opinion, the gallbladder flesh and other kind of specific gallstone dissolving herbs, in my opinion, are a little bit aggressive. And there is always a risk that, like, okay, if you really do put that kind of stress or strain on the gallbladder, it could actually stimulate, the
Totally.
lodging of a gallstone
100.
into the bile duct, and that's like the worst case scenario, right? So I really like this approach that is really just supporting this pathway most optimally with how we're eating. And the natural byproduct of that is that over time, slowly and very gently, the gallstones can get smaller and dissolve and not be an issue anymore.
Yeah, you brought up the herbs that can be used. Like, again, not a whole lot of science around a lot of these, but
Right.
herbs that can be used that can theoretically help to dissolve stones and break up stones. And maybe there would be more reason to consider that if there were like an active kind of flare of that right upper quadrant pain. And it's like, you got gallstones and it's kind of irritating, but not to the point of like full-blown cholecystitis. Maybe some of these herbs can be helpful for that acute phase. But more importantly, that's kind of like disaster relief, crisis management. More importantly, we want to avoid getting there. Again, just to reiterate, if we have gallstones that have been diagnosed or incidentally found, or we're wanting to make sure our gallbladder has the health and function that we want to provide it, then eating a nutrient-dense, carbohydrate-rich, whole food, plant-based diet that's rich in fiber and phytonutrients and naturally lower in fat is really the way to go to naturally promote the healthy biliary process and create the environment for the stones to dissolve themselves. And, everything else that is kind of the side effect from that.
Yes. All right. So once again, whole food plant-based eating for the win.
Yeah, and hopefully it's not like, I've heard, side tangent, I've heard some people say, oh, here's a, like, just on Instagram or whatever, like, this is a red flag. If anyone tells you that one way eating can help all of your ailments go away, like, that's a red flag. That's not true. And I was like, what? Like, that's not my experience. That's not my experience. So I think that we live in a world where, again, like, people have a hard time like understanding and considering that maybe there is an optimal way to fuel ourselves as human beings. Maybe we can do things in a way that's fully aligned with nature, and maybe there isn't like reductionistic, individualized, complicated, complex processes that are needed. Maybe it's much more simple than we are led to understand or think. So anyways, I think it is simple in my experience to, just give the body what it needs, the nutrients and resources and environment. And my understanding, everything fundamentally comes from the earth, and focusing on the plants that are and nutrients and foods that are closest to the earth, unprocessed, unadulterated, etc., that gives our body what we need. And I don't know, that's controversial. Anyways, little soapbox tangent to finish off our rant today.
It's good to have one of those every now and then.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, maybe I'll see you next week. Maybe not for another Medicinal Monday,
Yeah.
but probably Wednesday. We're on baby watch for those who don't know, and we do hope to be putting out more episodes. I don't know.
We might pre-record some stuff if we get around to it before this baby comes.
Yes.
Might pre-record some stuff, might not. But either way, we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.